Why I came here is an easy question to answer. Preet Utsav is a friend of mine. He went to attend a 10-day workshop that I gave last year in connection with a new educational system that I'm deploying, which talks about consciousness and quantum physics, quantum science, a theory of not only consciousness but all the human systems that we have developed as conscious beings. And so, we liked each other, and Lila I have met a few months before then. So the combination was irresistible when Preet expressed the desire that I should come to Tallinn and talk about the stuff that I do. And that's why I'm here, and I'm delighted that I'm here. The energies are very good. It is a question that is kind of thing that I ask myself sometimes. Closest I remember is that I was born and brought up in India and lived in India until I was 26 when I shifted. And I do remember my childhood upbringing with my parents very, very well, and it had many good aspects. For one thing, I was allowed to be homeschooled until I was 11. That was very, very good for me. I had a very wonderful experience of being a lot with myself at that young age. The parenting education that I got was finished by 9 o'clock in the morning, 7 to 9, that was all. And the rest of the day I had to myself. So that was all very nice. The part that was not nice and eventually made me quit the spiritual lessons that my parents were trying to instill in me was the inconsistencies that I saw in their behavior. At once they would tell me that all is one, consciousness is one, and we are all potentially one with everybody, and we should love each other and all this. But at the same time, I saw that although both my father and mother were spiritual beings, I could see that too, but I also would see them quite inconsistent. For example, my mother's relationship with my sisters-in-law, her daughters-in-law, were clearly very far from the image that I had how spiritual beings should behave. And my father similarly were very unkind to one of his own sons who had a habit of stammering. And he would very cruelly, I thought, would mimic his stammering, and the fellow was clearly hurt by that. And still my father would do that quite regularly. So these inconsistencies drew me, I think, to science, and the idea that theories should be verified with experimental data. I was especially curious about what science would say about this concept of all people being one. I could not see how that could be experimentally verified in some way. Little did I know that there would be such experiment in my own lifetime. Not only that, I would be instrumental in taking it much further than the experiment indicated. Nevertheless, even with that child's frame of mind, I decided that I should try science and its verification idea, theory and experiment together. So that's essentially the story that I can tell. Of course, many other factors probably were involved like everything else. But this was a factor, this much I can say. Well, all the quantum physicists played a huge role. Heisenberg himself was, co-discoverer of quantum physics. He himself had the notion that what happens in a quantum measurement is a change in our knowledge of the system. Now, this was very interesting. Initially, I was very obtuse to this idea because it's hard to understand why our knowledge can play a role. But when I came back to quantum physics at a ripe old age of about 40, at that time, I was looking at consciousness from the point of view of my own transformation, and those words from Heisenberg came back to me, and I truly began to ask the question of why should our knowledge, which to me translated as our consciousness, because consciousness is the vehicle by which we cognize. And the question became paramount, why should our consciousness be instrumental in deciding quantum measurement? Then I came across the work of John von Neumann, which had a tremendous impact. And then basically only a few other scientists who really played a huge role. For example, Rupert Sheldrake's work was very important. John Searle's work, is not a scientist really, a philosopher. His work was also very important. Then many other figures were also very important. Sri Aurobindo, a philosopher in India, Teilhard de Chardin, a Jesuit monk who was also a scientist in the West, they played a crucial role in terms of how to think about evolution. That was very basic. As far as the subject of healing, where I have contributed a lot, Deepak Chopra played a role. He wrote a book called Quantum Healing, which attracted my attention to the subject of health and healing. So that was important. In the field of economics, I greatly benefited by reading Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, the original start of capitalism. So I have been certainly helped by a lot of scientists. But on the whole, though, I must say that this has been a pretty lonely journey, because the mainstream scientists, they still do not pay much attention, although there is a tacit agreement now that yes, the consciousness solution of quantum physics is relevant and it does work, but still they do not really look at with full attention that the ideas that I have proposed and written about, and they are being used in psychology and medicine, they don't really look at the import of that. I mean, they're revolutionary concepts. We literally have solved 5,000-year-old problems about what consciousness is, what meaning and mind is about, what feelings are about. And I feel very sad that the scientific community is fundamentally oblivious about these things, because if they were paying attention, progress could have been so much faster. Well, the fundamental work that I did is still the most important work in my view. The fundamental work that I did was to interpret quantum physics in a paradox-free way. And this brought in Heisenberg and von Neumann's vision into proper paradox-free manner, in a way that consciousness becomes the fundamental being of reality. That to me was very important, because not only does it give quantum physics its paradox-free interpretation, but it establishes a genuine theory of something that has eluded us for 5,000 years. Namely, is there a science behind consciousness? You know, the basic thing that is about ourselves that we notice ever since we learned to speak and we are not a baby anymore, is that we experience things, we talk about ourselves as an I, and we obviously are enchanted by this I and what it does. And yet, you know, one of the things that I was always surprised, that we pay so much attention to physics, chemistry, and biology, but we don't really pay any attention to understanding consciousness. And really, it was amazing that nobody knew anything about consciousness for so long in a scientific way. And I could understand the problem, because of course physics is about objects, chemistry about objects, but biology, can that be about objects? Isn't living about the subject that lives? So these things were always kind of puzzling to me. Why doesn't science try to understand consciousness as a most fundamental endeavor? Because doesn't that define the human being? Of course, I myself would always shy away, because I'm just a physicist and consciousness is a problem of psychology was my upbringing. But then I realized that no, consciousness may belong to everyone. And when I discovered von Neumann's work especially, and Heisenberg's work I already knew, then I realized that quantum physics is actually the answer to consciousness. It's built into things that way, because human beings got to have a hint, and the hint is given through quantum physics. Quantum physics is the science of consciousness. Yes, the double slit experiment. This is a very important experiment for quantum physics. It makes it very clear what is so puzzling. You know, that statement of Niels Bohr that you quoted, that if one is not puzzled by quantum physics, one couldn't possibly understood quantum physics. It comes alive when we talk about double slit experiment. So let me describe the experiment first. It's about waves. When water waves are passed through a double slit, a screen with two slits in it, then they form a pattern that we call interference pattern, because the waves, every wave becomes two waves as they pass through the slits, and then these two waves interfere. They mix and mingle. What happens as a result is that in some places in front, the waves will reinforce one another. Other places they will destroy each other. Now, this destruction of waves, mutual destruction of waves, is something that particles can never do. Particles can bounce off each other, but they cannot destroy each other. Now, the waves really annihilate each other. There is no disturbance at all reaching in those places. We call them nodes, whereas other places the disturbance will be quite strong. We call them antinodes. So, this is very well known for water waves. Now, what Thomas Young found is that the light has the same property. He had a big debate going on with Newton. Newton believed that light consists of particles, but Young believed that no, they are waves. And this experiment was the crucial proof that experimentally Young needed to prove his point. And indeed, when light passes through two slits, then light wave also splits, becomes two waves which mix and mingle, and indeed produces in some places more light, other places light is completely gone, no light. So, this is the situation. So, we have an interference fringes, alternative bright and dark fringes of light. That is what appears in on a photographic plate if you pass light through double slit first. So, this was the situation, and everybody expected that light is a wave. And then in the year 1900, just about 100 years later, another scientist, Max Planck, he theorized that light has to be particle, call them quantum, discrete quantities, discrete energies. That is what light is. He did not talk about light, he talked about radiant energy, but Einstein made the connection 5 years later that radiant energy is nothing but a form of electromagnetic wave, sort of invisible light. And Einstein theorized that light must also be actually, like Planck is suggesting, particles, quantum. And Einstein knew that Young's work already proven experimentally that light is wave. And so himself he expressed the puzzle that look, it is very difficult to understand this. How can light be both wave and particle? So ever since that became called as the wave particle paradox. And then quantum physics, the equations of motion of quantum physics were discovered in 1925-26, and that should have given us a hint, because the equation clearly said that both light and electrons, every objects of matter or energy are really waves. They are not particles at all. It is, however, a fact that when we measure them, they become particle. So, this idea that every object that we experience are waves, this idea is the basic idea of quantum physics. This quantum physics applies to an object. That object has to be a wave. And it is also a fundamental idea of quantum science that when we measure these waves, and measurement was defined by von Neumann first, measurement must involve an observer. Whenever an observer observes, then the waves become particle. And this is then the mystery of quantum physics, and this is the mystery which is very hard to solve without raising paradoxes. This is the puzzling part of that Niels Bohr's famous statement. This is the part that I was able to solve, and I showed that a paradox-free interpretation of quantum physics can be found, but it is nothing like people have ever imagined. It squarely has to put up the philosophy that there is consciousness is the ground of being, not matter, and all objects are potentialities or possibilities of consciousness to choose from. That's what quantum physics is about. Quantum physics implicitly is a science of consciousness. Then all paradoxes can be solved. The very important point, as soon as we have said that quantum objects are possibilities for consciousness to choose from, what we are saying is that the wave that we talked about, that quantum objects are, is a wave of possibility. And so, when possibility is chosen from, it becomes a particle. A particle is nothing but a chosen version of a many-faceted object, that one aspect being chosen manifests itself as a particle in one place. Waves can be in many places, that's their original form as a potentiality, but then consciousness chooses only one place, and that's the place in which there is an appearance, and that's what we call a particle, a definite place for a particle to exist. Okay? So, what follows then is that in the wave form, objects are possibilities. Possibilities cannot reside, we don't find them in space and time. So, the question is, where do possibilities reside? And one has to boldly assume that possibilities must reside somewhere outside of space and time, call that another domain of reality. Domain of potentiality is a good name for it. But then how do we experimentally discern that? What is the difference between domain of potentiality and domain of actuality that space-time is? If we cannot define a measurable difference, then it would be very difficult to say that this is a scientific notion. Maybe it's an artificial notion only for conceptual purposes, but is not really measurable, is not really scientific. So, this doubt haunted people, except that 10 years after the discovery of quantum physics, Einstein, Podolsky and Rosen, three scientists, of which Einstein of course is a household name, they wrote a paper in which they showed that if this quantum physics idea is correct, then it follows that if two possibility objects interact, then they become, they didn't use the word entangled, they used the word correlated. They become so correlated as to display an astounding new characteristic, an unexpected new characteristic, which is that they will have instant communication, irrespective of what their distance is. Once they are correlated, which they would be if they come close and interact, but once they are correlated, however distance they move apart, they will still be able to communicate instantly. Now, this violates Einstein's own theory of relativity, according to which all communication must take place through a signal, and signals move at a finite speed less than or equal to the speed of light. So, Einstein knew all that. So, Einstein actually was quite gleeful, because he never liked quantum physics, and so he thought quantum physics is wrong, and this is the proof of it, because how can any communication travel faster than the speed of light? But of course, for people who were supposing that there must be a domain separate for this waves of possibility, they were also delighted in a way, because this was a way of discerning that domain of potentiality. So, they started putting a huge effort in measuring this effect, Einstein, Podolsky, Rosen effect. Are there really signal-less instant communication between quantum objects? And indeed, in 1982, Alain Aspect, a great physicist in France, and his collaborators, they discovered, measured such communication indeed exists. It astounded the world of physics, and ever since, physics has never been the same. And incidentally, that instant communication establishes the oneness that puzzled me so much in my childhood, the unity consciousness about which I thought there could never be any verification. How do you show that there is underlying unity among people when obviously separateness dominates our behavior? And now physics, the world of physics itself was saying that yes, there is potential unity between objects. All they have to do is to interact and they become one. So they must reside in a domain which is full of potential unity. And then from that it took me 4 years, but eventually I was able to conceptualize. I had a creative insight that showed that consciousness is the ground of being and objects are quantum possibilities for consciousness to choose from. So consciousness is that oneness, and two objects can interact and become correlated because consciousness then comes into play between them and mediates their instant communication. So, of course, the philosophy that matter comes first is called scientific materialism, and in that philosophy you really cannot include anything else as primary. Everything has to be the consequence of matter and material interactions. The quantum worldview has a fundamental advantage. Here objects are posited as possibilities, waves of possibility, and then if we see that these possibilities are possibility of a being that is unity being, then this unity being chooses, and it is obvious that the results of their choice is an observer looking at an object. Now, crucial here is to understand what von Neumann said about the role of the observer. Von Neumann already pointed out that a quantum measurement must include an observer. This was very new because before that people always thought that a measurement is done by a measurement apparatus. But von Neumann said that is impossible because an apparatus is also quantum possibility because it's made of quantum possibilities. There's no way out of that. And so observer must be something that is outside of the quantum calculus. And how can that be? Von Neumann himself said that the observer has a self, subject. Observer has an eye that looks, the experiencer. Observer's consciousness is the difference. Subject, the capacity of being a subject. So that then is the crucial point, and von Neumann's logic did not hold together only because if it is an individual subject, that's what von Neumann thought, then there is a paradox, because you and I both can look at a quantum event, and naturally you may choose differently than I choose. Then whose choice counts? Who gets to choose, really choose? Because both of us cannot have the same choice. An electron cannot collapse in two different places. So who gets to choose? This question von Neumann's resolution could not answer. And this question can be answered only if we assume that consciousness is one. If we are both looking, that looking correlates us, and consciousness is really one between us. Consciousness chooses. It's not our individual consciousness that chooses. It's the totality of consciousness, that oneness, that chooses. That's the resolution of that paradox. Actually, the question of paradigm and paradigm shift applies very much to the current situation. In fact, this is the most astounding paradigm shift perhaps that has ever happened. Previous paradigm shifts were always were in a specific field, in a specific model, where the ideas were very far reaching. For example, the paradigm shift that comes to mind, which is almost of the equal importance as the current paradigm shift, because that was also very monumental in human history. It changed from a religious worldview into a scientific worldview. I'm talking about, of course, the paradigm shift from the Ptolemy system of looking at astronomy versus the solar system that Copernicus discovered, that planets go around the sun, not that the sun goes around the earth. So, but this is still just astronomy. It began with astronomy. The results were far-reaching, and indeed it involved every field of human endeavor eventually, Newtonian physics. But the beginning was just astronomy. So that made it simple. Whereas what is happening now, it's a very difficult situation. I remember when I put forth this model of consciousness is the ground of all being and all objects are possibilities of consciousness to choose from. One of my colleagues immediately said, but how can you use a psychological concept to solve a physics problem? Isn't physics the fundamental of all sciences? Isn't psychology a consequence of physics? How can you say that consciousness, a psychological concept, can solve a problem of physics? So you see the difficulty I'm getting at. Interdisciplinary. This problem of consciousness is interdisciplinary. It goes into all kinds of discipline. The results of the quantum worldview that I have formulated, its consequences mainly are not in physics, but mainly in the subject of biology, in health, and in psychology and other human systems, perhaps even economics, but not much in physics, whereas physicists are the only ones who feel comfortable with quantum physics. So if I talk to a biologist, say we have got a new model of life, would you like to hear it? And as soon as I say it involves quantum physics, they say, I don't know quantum physics, go talk to a physicist. And of course, if I go talk to a physicist say, consciousness, it's a concept of psychology, I know nothing about it. Why talk to me? And this has been a fundamental problem of getting scientists to read anything about the work that involves so many fields, especially so many fields that can be impacted by it. Fortunately, some of the scientists, they are much more oriented towards results. Like the health scientists, they don't care very much about ism or philosophy or the theory. They are interested in the fact that I have something new to say about health and healing, or mental health and mental healing. And so they listen because they are interested in the results. Actually, it's interesting because people, materialist scientists, Stephen Hawking, one of them, they have talked about theory of everything, and many people really think that if we can find the secret of elementary particles, the ultimate theory would be found, because they really believe that the reality is made of elementary particles. But of course, that kind of science does not have any inkling about what human beings are about, which is consciousness. Because consciousness, as you have already gone through repeatedly, has aspects of not only an object but also a subject, experiencer of objects. And experiences don't fit into the picture of elementary particles making up the world. Elementary particle is an object, therefore the world that they made up is also an object. Consciousness is the one that observes the object. And in quantum physics that is fundamental, because observation is intricately and intimately connected with what is observed. We cannot make a theory of what is observed without putting the observer into the equation, because otherwise measurement cannot be defined. So that basic picture forgets about quantum physics and its lesson. And of course, that cannot give us a theory of everything, because it does not give us a theory of consciousness. Quantum physics, on the other hand, and quantum worldview that I have constructed, has some elementary claim, at least, that it can give a theory of everything. I have written a book called Everything Answer Book with that in mind, that indeed, in my judgment, all the basic questions of human beings can be answered by quantum worldview, namely life, meaning of life, death, meaning of death, God, meaning of God, spirituality, spiritual transformation, personal growth, even social systems like what is the best way of forming an economy, and indeed the answer is indeed what we already have, capitalism, but in a generalized form. What is the best form of political system we should have? The answer is completely, unequivocally, democracy is the only scientific social system that we can build for politics. So in this way, it's really astounding that the new science can give us answers to almost everything. Of course, there already are signs that if you have to believe what many people are already experiencing, if you have to believe everything that people experience, for example, there are many people who talk about UFO, and then there are other people in spiritual circles who talk about beings of light. If you start giving them credence, then certainly even this quantum paradigm is not quite adequate to explain those things. But except for those, we can explain all the credible human phenomena. So there is a theory of everything in that sense now. Because you have become used to the exact logic that mathematical equations represent. But at the same time, you have to understand that there is something fundamentally incompatible here. If you have equations, that means that we can make predictions. If we can make predictions, can there be consciousness about it? If you think about it, predictions and consciousness does not jive. Consciousness has to have fundamentally unanswerable aspect. Otherwise, why is consciousness necessary at all? The very fact that we have consciousness shows that mathematics is not an adequate description of nature. Yes, mathematics is a convenient description of parts of nature, the deterministic part of nature, where mathematics indeed give us very determined, predictable and controllable answers, and that's very nice. We certainly can enjoy that. That enables us to control nature to some extent, the inanimate nature. But at the same time, it's very wonderful that there is no mathematics for quantum measurement, which means that consciousness can enter with its basic unpredictability that has to be there, because otherwise there is no creativity, there is nothing new that can happen. and the entire need for consciousness disappears. The way we look at consciousness and experience, the fundamental way that we look at this phenomena has to change. We have become used to looking at consciousness as if it's an object, but of course it is not. The fundamental mystery of consciousness, if you call it a mystery, it is in a large sense, is the fact that consciousness means that the subject looking at an object. It means the pair, subject and object. Conscious awareness has two poles. One is not an object. One looks at an object. Qualitatively different concept. And that is absolutely essential part of consciousness. Many people still continue to make models of consciousness as if consciousness is just an object, because they only know how to make science of objects. This quantum science came about so unexpectedly that it made a room for a subject. Consciousness divides itself into subject and object because consciousness identifies with the brain. This is how the subject arises. And then the question can be answered. Can we have a subject in the brain? Yes, we can have a subject in the brain because in the process of quantum measurement, consciousness identifies with the brain. Can we have a subject in any place else in the body? Yes, we now have the very wonderful proposition that there is a subject in the what Easterners call heart chakra, connected with the immune system function. Can the immune system have such a ability of cognition that subject implies? Yes, it does indeed. Immune system is responsible for the feeling of love. That's how it cognizes, through love, feeling. And even the gastrointestinal system, in the ancient language navel chakra, even that has a self. Again, it can also cognize by virtue of feeling. So the neocortical self that cognizes with mind, meaning, and the selves in the body, they cognize with feeling. That's the difference. Initially, the cognition was with respect to feeling. A single living cell can also cognize. It again cognizes with feeling. Cognition with meaning, of course, is a much vaster, superior way to cognize, because we now give the cognition much better form, much better description. We can give so much description that we can even form a worldview with our mind. Animals have feelings, they don't have worldviews. They are limited because feelings are very limited way to cognize the world. But to say that they don't cognize is not true either, because we have plenty of evidence that animals can cognize. They are not machine. They have experiences. They can know at least about their masters and about the humans who make them into pets. That much they know. So this way of thinking is obviously better because it also fits the idea of animal consciousness. Quantum physics says we have to have free will, because quantum physics says that the measurement can be explained only if we say that it is a choice of consciousness, and that's a free choice. So quantum physics is in fact adamant that there is free will. The experiments that you referred to, cognitive experiments, initially there was this proof that if a person gives the usual demonstration of free will, namely I will raise my arm and therefore I have free will, that is not tenable with experimental data, because if the person's brain is connected to a electroencephalogram machine, then it just so happens that even before he raises his arm, 900 milliseconds before that, the brain already is acting. That can be measured by the EEG machine, and that will give away the secret that this person is going to raise his or her arm. So what kind of free will is that which can be predicted? That was the idea. And then Benjamin Libet came around, another neuroscientist. He showed that this is not quite true, because between the free willing thinking and the action, raising the arm, there is a gap of roughly 200-300 milliseconds. And during the gap, Libet instructed his subjects to not raise their arm. After they had the free willing thought that I want to raise my arm because that's the intention of the experimenter, but the experimenter also told them that after you have that thought, see if you can resist that action. And indeed, many of his subjects were able to resist the action. Even after they thought about, okay, now is the time for me to raise my arm, and as soon as they had the thought, they started resisting the thought, and indeed they could. 200 milliseconds were enough for them to resist the thought. So in this way, Libet's experiment can be interpreted as proving that we never lose the prerogative of saying no to our conditioned action. Yes, if you tell me that, okay, Amit, with the next 5 minutes you raise your arm to prove your free will. I am indeed just taking part in a conditioned action, not my original action at all, but saying no to my conditioned action is an example of my free will. Oh, I sympathize with everybody who feels that way. Indeed, the word quantum is extremely limited. The word quantum just means quantity in Latin. And even if you look at the early days of quantum physics, especially Max Planck, he is talking about quantum, a discrete quantity of energy. That's the meaning he gave. In that, quantum physics is not revolutionary at all. Quantum physics, just literal meaning, is just the physics of elementary particles, physics of elementary quantities of matter and energy. That's what quantum physics is. But obviously, that's an extremely limited definition. Limited definition because it's defining a physics with respect to the objects it governs. But how can that be? That never has been the intention. If that was the intention, then Newton's physics was constructed with material objects in mind. But did we hesitate to apply Newtonian physics to behavioral psychology? We didn't. We said that no, the same idea of Newtonian physics applies, and indeed human behavior was found to conform to the same kind of Newtonian predict and control kind of aspect. So we always gain by taking an idea which was initially created for a limited application in mind into much bigger applications. The power of quantum physics in human affairs reveals itself when we realize that even the behavior of the elementary particles, even they are dependent on conscious choice. Consciousness plays a role. And since consciousness plays a role, it is automatic that we will look at all conscious experience and look at them as quantum phenomena. So in this way, it's very natural, the expansion that I have suggested, that the quantum physics be extended to the behavior of mental objects and objects of feeling, is quite natural, because they have the same quantum properties that is the characteristic of material objects, such as signal-less communication or non-locality, discontinuity of quantum leaps that Niels Bohr originally discovered. So these things are common for material objects as well as mental objects as well as objects of feeling. They all have non-locality, they all have discontinuous quantum leaps. So it is very natural to explain their behavior too with the same quantum physics as matter. And then it becomes a very powerful science for predicting human behavior. Then we can make models of things that we could not have made before, such as models of creativity, such as models of evolution, models of reincarnation even, ideas that we never could even touch before. We can now not only touch, but we can treat and predict new phenomena. Is that good? Quantum activism. Well, this is an intriguing phrase, and it is intended that way. The first thing that came to my mind when I coined the phrase and started a movement was that quantum physics is not really getting much attention from the scientists, partly because the physics is difficult to understand, traditionally has been difficult to understand, but that's because of the prejudice of scientific materialism. As soon as you give up the prejudice, my work proves that it is very easy to understand, that objects are possibilities for consciousness to choose from. Nevertheless, there is a lot of reluctance on the part of the main body of scientists to give up the idea of scientific materialism, in spite of the fact that we have quantum non-locality, which does not fit the Newtonian model at all. According to Newtonian physics, there can only be space and time, there can only be separateness. To have the idea that there could be underlying unity is unthinkable in Newtonian physics. To have the idea that consciousness can choose among the potentiality to make actuality is unthinkable. We cannot introduce consciousness in Newtonian physics because it's deterministic. Consciousness has to have indeterminacy or uncertainty built into the physics in order for consciousness to play a role. Freedom is part of consciousness. New possibility is part of consciousness. New possibilities to choose from. So I thought that we should have activism to change the attitude of scientists towards quantum physics. That was my first thinking. But then I realized that it is much more than that, because a quantum activist not only needs to persuade other people as to the usefulness or veracity of quantum science for human affairs, but it is also a fact that the weapon in the hands of the quantum physicist is persuasion. Change the other person's choice. The other person's choice can be Newtonian physics or quantum physics. And the quantum physicist has to persuade the other, not use force, because that's not allowed in quantum physics. Consciousness works through choice. So how can you persuade? You can persuade only if you have shown the efficacy of the ideas that you are trying to persuade in your own life, because you are trying to say that, look, if you live the quantum way, you will be better off. But if you have not shown the efficacy in your own life, obviously your credibility is not so good. So quantum activism then must be formulated as the idea of changing one's own life, living the quantum principles. And as you do that, as you prove the efficacy of the quantum principles to live life, you propose to others, persuade others that, look, here is a better system for human beings to live by, and therefore you pay attention to quantum physics. Therefore you pay attention to changing human social systems with quantum physics. But only because quantum physics gives you the ability to change yourself, transform yourself. So in this way, from the get-go, quantum activism has been a movement of really integrating science and spirituality in a person's own life, and then bring the impact of that, what happens to human social systems if science and spirituality are indeed integrated. Purpose comes into our equations of human life and the equation of life in general in two different ways. First of all, we find that living not only has the hardware it takes to live, namely our physical body and organs, but concept of software is essential for including living. In fact, living means software. Of course, then the question comes, is the software a random software that nature puts on the hardware through evolution, as a Darwinist would show or predict or propose, or is the software purposive? And we find that indeed software, like all software that we create on our computer, is purposive. Living is purposive. All the organs perform purposive function. Every organ has a purpose, and software allows it to carry out that purpose. So causal laws just does not apply, but a law like quantum physics can apply, because choice, which is the causal force in quantum physics, can be purposive. But then question comes, what is the overall purpose of the movement of consciousness? For that we have to look into evolution, which I did, and I found that there is already a theory in place of evolution given by two philosophers, Sri Aurobindo in India and Teilhard in the West. They both suggested that evolution has a purpose of making better and better representations of what they call the ideas of consciousness. Those ideas are, some of them we feel, some of them we give meaning to, and some of them sets the context of feeling and meaning. They are called archetypes. So what is then the purpose of evolution? Purpose of evolution make representations of those vehicles that enable us to feel, then representations of meaning, mind, and finally representations of the archetypes themselves. That's the ultimate purpose. What are archetypes? They are the objects that we intuit: love, beauty, justice, truth, goodness, wholeness, this kind of thing. So Aurobindo and Listak themselves, they proposed that we already have made the evolution of all the feelings that we could have. This is called the biospheric part of reality on Earth. And then we have noosphere, which is the thinking. We have almost finished that part, and the part that is now left is what is archetypal. Aurobindo called it supramental. So present purpose of human beings is to develop representations of the supramental on Earth. How do we do it? Supramental, we do not have direct capacity of making memory of the supramental. This is a problem. So we have to make indirect representations of the supramental through our mind and through our vital feelings. Can we do that? Yes, we can do that. We have been doing that. And that part of us, some people call it a soul, soul making. Some people call it higher mind and noble feelings. Whichever name you call it, that's the purpose, present purpose of the human life, to make soul, to make better representations of this archetype. Capacity to love, capacity to be fair to others, capacity to be good to others, capacity for wholeness. These are our major objectives. And look at what is happening. Indeed, we are much closer to truth today with the discovery of quantum physics and a science of consciousness. We are much closer to love. Never before have we been able to understand what love is, and basically today we have a science of love. It's tremendous advancement. And other sphere too, we can talk about justice, for the first time in human history. Today we are not only fair to men, but also to women almost equally, not quite, and even to people who have always been discriminated against, people who are called homosexuals because of their sexual preference. They were more or less outside of human societies before, always have been persecuted. Now they are almost completely legal citizens almost everywhere. So we have made major progress in how we represent these archetypes in recent times. I think this is a very, very good sign that we are moving in the right direction of the purposive movement of consciousness. Very good question. Can we reach enlightenment using the teachings of quantum science? Yes, we can. Actually, one of my surprises was that perhaps because I come from the Indian tradition, and Indian tradition is very deep in terms of the spiritual states that we can attain in this very life. And they talk about states of consciousness which are beyond the usual states that we can readily identify. It's easy to define what a waking state of consciousness is, although very hard to explain, as we already have said. Waking state has subject and objects that split. It's impossible to explain on the basis of scientific materialism, as you have discussed already, but quantum physics can answer it. Similarly, in dream consciousness, quantum physics answers very easily. For sleep, even materialist physics can at least explain the state of sleep. Unconscious is one explanation, is that unconscious is just inert. When we are sleeping, we are like a rock. At least that kind of explanation can be given even in scientific materialism. In quantum physics, the explanation is deeper. Okay, unconscious, deep sleep. We have some activities. Why? Because unconscious processing is going on. Things are going on in the unconscious. Our memories are still active. So that part of the brain is active. So brain goes into delta wave, not completely inert, not like a stone by any means. So all that's still easy, right? Even meditative states that we reach, yes, there are slow waves like beta waves in when we are waking awareness, but then we are relaxed, alpha waves, then we are drowsy, theta waves, and then we are deep sleep, delta waves. All that is understood. We can understand that by meditation we go from beta into alpha because we become more relaxed. All that is easy. But then the spiritual traditions really become tough when they say, well, enlightened. Enlightenment itself is not very hard from quantum physics point of view, because the idea is simply that we encounter what in the tradition is called inner self. In quantum physics, we call it quantum self. That's a self without any memory, which means it is a self where there is no memory to be made, which means that there is no me that I remember from the past. It is just a forever I. So quantum physics has an explanation of what that enlightenment means, to encounter a deep self, which is the real I, for which there is no objectification, no memory is possible. It's forever an alive experience, never to be repeated, not in that way. We cannot relive it because that experience is not in the memory, not possible to memorize it. So all that can be understood. But then mystics go very deep. They talk about a state of consciousness where indeed they are just one. And they say that we experience it. How can you experience oneness? Experience requires subject-object split. This is antithetical, right? But all religious traditions have that. They call it by different name. In Christianity, for example, the idea is God realization. We realize that we are one with God. We spend time with God and then we come back and we can talk about this very strange concept. Can one do that? But quantum physics has a concept called delayed choice, which does explain even this kind of experience. So one of my surprises has been that even the phenomenon of enlightenment, spiritual enlightenment, can be understood with the new quantum science. Every human experience that I know of, except this latest craze about extraterrestrials and about this, some of the experience that people have started talking about that goes beyond even quantum science. That requires new hypothesis. But other than that, every known experience quantum science can entertain and explain. The fundamental message of quantum physics actually is that life should be lived in a way that conforms to our being. Since our being is fundamentally based on this unity consciousness, so we should spend bulk our life in the exploration of that unity. And that suggests that we engage a bulk of our day to what is called creativity, because the unity consciousness lies in the new part of the unconscious. Unconscious has the old part, the memory part, which dominates our conscious experience. We are always thinking of memories, and in that we are living in the past, we are living in the known. Whereas the real life part of consciousness, the interesting part of consciousness, which is this part which we have not explored before, the new part. Of course, the new part has to be expressed in terms of what we already know. Expression requires the known, so the lesson of quantum living is very clear. We should live in such a way that we constantly encounter the new in a creative experience, and then we make representation of the new in terms of the old. So we need the ego for that also. So, quantum physics suggests this is quite different from traditional spirituality. In traditional spirituality, the goal is to give up the ego and embrace the quantum self completely. The unity is everything. Quantum worldview is not talking like that. Quantum worldview is saying that the best is really to have both. We need the new because that's where the essence of consciousness is, but in order to express the new, we need the old. Otherwise, there is no expression. So, we need both. Now, this state in creativity, which allows one to be both in the ego and in the quantum self, alternatively, in a flow, is called the flow experience. This is one of the more recent discoveries of psychology. And this is the model fit for a quantum activist. Quantum activists who live in a creative flow, in a state of creative flow, neither in the ego, like the traditional scientific materialist, nor in the quantum self, like the traditional spiritual being, but in a mixture of both, which is also turns out to be a very joyful state. Big advantage is that you can be enlightened in some sense because you are encountering the unity, but at the same time you are enjoying it. I call it the state of having your cake and also eating it. Best of both worlds. Truly an integration of science, which prefers this end, and spirituality, which prefers that end. Quantum physics says, be in the middle, enjoy both. As far as doing, there is a very, very beautiful way of being creative. I call it the doobie-doobie-doo way of life. It turns out that when we do, we are very scatterbrained, we are doing, but we are not focused. If we do in a focused way, and then not do incessantly, because the human brain is not capable of continuously focused doing, we get tired. In between, we relax. This brings into mind the idea of meditation. So, quantum physics supports meditation in a huge way. Meditation, we have focusing, doing meditation, as also relaxing meditation. We can call them being meditation. And this doobie-doobie-doo is a very beautiful way of becoming creative. And then, once we are creative, we have the creative experience, and then when we manifest the creative experience, then that flow experience happens between the quantum self and the ego. So, the lifestyle of a quantum activist then is not only flow, but flow has to be preceded by this doobie-doobie-doo way of life. And what can we do to promote it? The two kinds of meditation. One is the focusing meditation, and another is the relaxation meditation. One is meditation on an object, the other is meditation on the subject. If we do these kinds of meditation some of the time engage in creative flow, manifesting our creative insights, then we are indeed living like a quantum aficionado.